Sister Anwen is their sub-prioress. She is not one for politics, but she keeps accounts. If she knows, she keeps them with a fierceness. I will write her a note. You will not enter the convent dressed as you are. You will not mention the ledger by name. You will bring yourself as a student of the scriptorium seeking to copy an old text. If the prioress cares to reveal, she will do so. If not, if she refuses or hands you over to the chancellor, we must be prepared to claim we sought only scholarship. The plot that formed in that moment was not the bold sweep of a revolutionary plan, but a series of small logistic acts, a folded note, the right place to sit, a phrase that would invite confidence. Edda's mind worked like a quill, paring and rubbing with a quickness that suggested she had once been more dangerous than she let on. Matthias felt both relieved and frightened. The relief was a thin thing that smelled of paste and old paper, while the fear was the weight of a ledger pressed flat against his ribs. "Why are you doing this, Edda?" he asked, though by now he knew the general answers. Loyalty to books, to truth, to old convents, these were rewards he could not hand her. He wanted to know if she had some other debt. She laughed then, a brief sound that surprised him because it was not bitter. "Because I cannot bear another generation to say the same lie and imagine there is no cost. Because the Chancellor's truth is costly to ordinary people. Because I learned early that paper could be a weapon either to smother or to expose. And frankly, because you look like a man who will not let it rest on his conscience, and that kind of person can be useful." It was not flattery. It was the precise appraisal of a woman who had been trained to read faces as if they were marginalia. He left the sentence lodged in his chest like a pin. He thought of home, his mother standing at the hearth, humming and washing out the day's ink from a child's shirt. His cousin, perhaps on the list he had seen. The narrow alleys where merchants cursed the authorities but paid their taxes all the same. He had not come to the scriptorium to become a conspirator. He had come because his hands knew that paper could hold secrets, and that some secrets could not be allowed to lie. When he rose to leave, Edda pushed a folded scrap of paper across the desk, an address, a name. Her writing was quick and spidery. "Do not go alone if you can avoid it. If the convent will help, we will need a witness who is not our enemy. I have someone who can introduce you quietly. I will speak to Sister Anwen on your behalf, but not with the ledger yet. The first meeting is for faces and tone. Do not ask of them what you are not ready to bear in front of another human voice." As he pulled the scrap into his palm, he realized the simple idiom she used, faces, and tone, was a kind of counsel about how to behave in the presence of memory. It would not be enough to produce paper. People required gentleness. They required the correct cadence of appeal. If the ledger carried an accusation, it would need the human warmth of testimony to make it believable beyond the suspicion of forgery. Outside, the city had the thin grey light of an early winter afternoon. Rain had been intermittent all morning. Now the drops on the stone of the courtyard made tiny black pox that bloomed and vanished like open wounds. Thomas passed on a cart, braced against the weather and carrying nothing that looked like scandal. For a moment the ordinary motions of the world made him dizzy with longing. How simple it would be to walk home and unburden himself to no one and let the ledger sit in its quiet place, a burnt thing, unjudged. The thought lasted as long as it takes to close a book. Edda stood at the curtained doorway and watched him go. "One more thing," she called, and he paused. She did not need to raise her voice. The scriptorium was generous with echoes. "If you are found with the ledger, do not pretend ignorance. The best defense for a scribe is a clear conscience, not a false one. Play the honest fool if you must. The court punishes the calculated liar more harshly than the mistaken man." He laughed, a small sound only, because he was more afraid than he had been an hour before. Her advice was practical and terrible. There was a loop of logic there. Confessing a small fault might save his family. And yet confession would spread the ledger's story in a place where truth was guarded by men who could turn evidence into instruments. Edda's counsel was like many things in their profession, precise, pragmatic, and shrewdly ruthless when kindness might invite more danger. Matthias folded the scrap and put it inside his breastcoat, near the spot where he kept the little notes he used to remember strange abbreviations and odd seals. As he walked back through the scriptorium's aisles, he noticed for the first time the small ways in which the room closed, heads inclined, eyes precise, the careful avoidance of idle glances. He had always loved the place for its exactness. Now, and with a shock that felt almost obscene, he loved it for its opportunity to lie. It was not exactly a betrayal to lie to those who would burn pages. It was survival, he told himself. Yet the ledger, its burned smell, its penciled margin, the names that matched the alleys of his childhood, kept pressing against the inside of his chest. He had not expected to find an accomplice so quickly. He had not expected to find someone whose voice could both steady and unsettle him. Edda's offer was a lifeline and a rope. He could not push it away. At the stairhead he turned and looked back. The curtain fluttered as if someone moved in the gloom. He imagined the pages they would carry to Sister Arnwin wrapped in wax, bound with twine, the letters of old debts. The path ahead required more than courage. It required cunning, patience, and a willingness to let names shift from ledger rows to human mouths. As he stepped into the rain and the city's bustle, he felt the ledger's small gravity pull at him like a secret tide. He had another appointment, now a destination on a scrap of paper and a woman's sober face, to whom he must make himself known. Guilt hummed in his bones like an old clock. It did not toll, but it marked the hours, relentless and impossible to slow. The alliance with Edda was made. The next move was toward convent walls and candlelight, where the past might be read aloud or hidden away forever. He pulled his collar up against the damp and began to walk toward the west gate, where the city remembered other winters. The rain was a fine wire on his cheek. He had the scrap of paper and a caution that would not stop at the scriptorium's threshold. The ledger waited somewhere in a stack of misfiles, patient as an accusation. As he moved away from Edda's lamp-lit alcove, the corridor behind him exhaled a quiet that felt more like a preparation. When the city swallowed him, he carried with him Edda's words in a pocket near his heart, and the knowledge that to seek truth was to risk making enemies out of men who governed by the art of forgetting. The ledger was no longer merely a misfiled book. It had become an obligation. He had begun a process he could not easily unravel, and as the rain stitched patterns across the stones, a small, dreadful excitement coiled in him. He had taken the road that led to a convent cellar and, possibly, toward a ruin that could unmake everything he had ever allowed himself to trust. At the outer gate he paused long enough to watch a cart turn in the mud, to listen to the cough of a child, to let the ordinary details of life feed his resolve. The next act would demand reticence and the right words. For now, he had a companion in the dark, Edda's quiet cache, and a meeting to arrange. The ledger, untouched and dangerous, lay like a small, hot coal waiting for the right breath. Behind him in the scriptorium, the little noises of daily record keeping continued. Someone folded an official page with ritual exactness. Somewhere a sealed letter slid under a door. The chronicle would go on, smoothing over the city's scars tomorrow as it had every day since the rebuilding began. But for the first time in years, Matthias felt a fissure in its smooth face, small, marginal, the exact place where a hand might later press and find the underlying dark. He did not know if that fissure would heal or widen. He only knew that he had passed the point where silence would be simple. He had told Edda, and in the telling, the ledger's names had become less alone. He walked on and the rain grew colder, as if setting the city's face to a frost. The next step lay ahead, Sister Arnwin's convent, a cellar that kept the past like a fire, a woman who might read the ledger and speak its names aloud. And in the wet dusk his conscience kept pace, an unquiet metronome that would not let him rest. Matthias set out with a pencil tucked behind his ear, not for the first time aware of how small tools seemed to fit the work of the world. The scriptorium's narrow windows had not yet let in day when he left. Thin strips of blue light cut like scrim through the palace gloom. And the city beyond was still a sheet of grey breath, the ruins along the river no more than silhouettes in the cold. He walked past the stone pillars of the municipal gate with his hands folded inside his sleeves, holding himself as if he might keep his heart from being seen. It was easier, he thought, to attend to things that could be measured lines of ink, the exact tilt of an abbreviation, than to the dim shapes of human complicity. Thomas found him by the messenger post, where the men and women who tethered their lives to horses and rumour were already awake and bargaining with sleep. The post smelled of leather and wet straw and the last embers of the brazier. Thomas' face was more wind-burned than the last time Matthias had seen him. A new nick at the ear had crusted and gone. He dropped the satchel at his feet with an economy of movement learned from years of loading and leaving. "You look as if you've been emptied of sleep," Matthias said, the directness of his voice surprising him. It was an attempt at brightness that failed. He felt the ledger's weight beneath his tongue like an unwanted taste. Thomas shrugged. "Sleep keeps for the dead. We keep to the roads." He leaned forward. His breath came in the precise cadence of a man accustomed to the near-accidental confessions of strangers. "There's talk down at the quay," he said. "A packet changed hands the week after the surrender. Heavy things wrapped in oilcloth. I saw the man who took it. He paid in sovereigns, and he didn't look like a common courier." Matthias' chest narrowed. He had expected certain things, that the market would have its gossip, that a ledger would not remain forever private, but the immediacy of Thomas' detail had a crackling quality. "Sovereigns," he repeated. "Who was he?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know his name. He came by coach from the West Gate, and he had a blue banner on the side of his cart. He paid the dockman at the small moontide berth under the lamps, and he left the way the merchants leave when they mean to be invisible." "Blue banner?" Matthias asked. For a moment he could see nothing but blue. Names meant places, and places opened into reason. Banners, like entries in the Chronicle, performed an identity whether the thing beneath them deserved it or not. "They fly for traders down at the river," Thomas said, as if this explained away everything. "Marlin and company use blue. Or they did. There's been more than one banner since the war." Matthias kept the name as if it were a sketched arrow. He had not the right to dispatch the scriptorium's resources on a rumor, not while duties soaked his days, but curiosity that dull. Relentless clerk at the edge of conscience had its own ledger. He gave Thomas the small coin he always carried for couriers, not as payment but as a code, that he trusted the man with a question and a time. The market had been born in the half-light by the time Matthias reached it, a living thing composed of staggered cries and the slow turning of carts. He had thought of the market before as an adjunct to history, a place where memory was salted, preserved and sometimes salted again to keep it palatable. To enter it properly, he reminded himself, he would have to adopt its currency, not legal tender but small favors, truthful exaggeration, and the patience to listen. The smells hit him first: cedar and dried figs, a simmering broth of bones and garlic, the metallic tang of fish. There was a rope of smoke from the baker's stall. The tang of saffron pleased his mouth in a way he could not explain. Markets were made of such details, and a ledger official, stone-faced, broke abruptly into that texture like a shard of white glass. Mera's stall was a riot of color: sacks of dried orange peel, bundles of thyme, nets of onions, and a heap of bright peppers that looked like sculpted embers. Mira herself had the blunt, clean face of someone who had carved too many prices from the daily world. Her hands were quick and true and smelled of oil and citrus. "You seek a thing that isn't for sale," she said, as if she had been expecting him. Her voice was the precise, economical currency of a person who had made a living from other people's needs. Or you're trying to buy a rumor cheap?" Matthias smiled, though it was thin. "Both," he said. "I need a different sort of price. A story from when the city was making itself again. A trade, a favor for the trouble of talking." She lifted an eyebrow. Around them, customers scrutinized her wares like judges. She picked up a length of hemp and twined it between her fingers, watching him as if she might see through the plainness of his face. "You'd be better starting with the watchmen," she said. "They keep their night like it was an oath." "I already spoke to Thomas," he said. A packet changed hands at the quay. "Goodman Thomas." She nodded as if the name had utility beyond familiarity. "I saw a pack brought to the moon berth." A little later a man in a grey coat came and bought a bag of pepper and paid with a handful of sovereigns. He didn't bargain, which is curious. People who don't bargain either have too little or too much. The baker saw him, and the boy who runs the fish stall. Only the fish boy used words. He said the man smelled of old paper. Matthias felt the ledger's edges brush his palms. "Old paper," he translated aloud, as if currency could be rendered into meaning. Did anyone see what the man did with the packet? Mira's face softened with the precise calculation of a woman who had seen too many faces decide to stay silent. "He gave it to a cart with a torn blue banner," she said. The cart stopped by the alley that runs along the old tannery and took the lane that leads to the river. There was a watchman on the bench by the arch. Bird was there. He cursed when the cart passed. He didn't like the look of the seal. He kept looking at the man's hands. Bird. The name slid into place like a tile in a mosaic. Matthias remembered the old watchman who sat beneath the fountain near the bridge, who had a tendency to hum songs that were older than his years. He had seen Bird at the scriptorium door before, a shadow that belonged to a generation that had walked through the rebellion and had stood aside. If Bird had seen a seal, if he had watched hands, then this was no mere rumor. It was a memory with witnesses. The market's noise drew away like tide, leaving the two of them with a strip of sunlight and the smell of fried dough. Mira leaned closer, as if confiding a sacred thing. "If you want to know more, don't ask the baker or the fish boy in front of their stalls. Go to the side where the alahhouse throws its shadow. Ask if a man collects debts for coin. They always have one who remembers the night the city paid for peace." Matthias thanked her with a coin that had a small hole drilled through it for a string. It was the sort of gesture that meant, "I will remember you." She nodded, as if that was payment enough. He found Bird where Mira had said, a brittle figure perched on a bench near the old fountain, a place where pigeons clustered and the water kept its slow insistence against stone. Bird's coat held the rank scent of 1,000 washes. His hands were blunt with work, and he eyed Matthias as a harbor eyes a boat one is uncertain about mooring. "You write books for the palace," he said before Matthias had spoken. There was no accusation in it, only a blunt observation as if it were a weather report. "You have the look of someone who marks ink with a frown. And you have the look of someone who has kept nights with a bell and a rod." Matthias returned. "Bird, I want to ask you about last autumn, about a cart with a blue banner." The old man's eyes narrowed. He took a moment to arrange the memory in his chest as a careful man lays out tools. "It was a night of rain," he began, and for Matthias the detail of the weather was itself a proof memories align most strongly to the senses. There were fewer people on the quay because of the wind. The lamps spit. I was watching the moon berth. A man came down by the townhouse of the old rope maker. He had a packet wrapped in oilcloth. He paid the dockman 2 sovereigns for silence. 2 sovereigns. Matthias repeated. That coin, he knew, meant the sort of wealth that would not be spent on bread. It was a payment that bought discretion more than goods. Bird nodded. He had a signet on the flap. It was smudged, but I saw a crescent. It's the sort of mark men of office carry. He gave the oilcloth to a cart. It was a big cart with a blue banner that had been torn. Someone had tried to hide which merchant it belonged to. They took it to the river arch. The cart turned toward the mills. "Do you remember the hands?" Matthias asked, because hands in their gestures and stains tell stories that faces will not. Were they like those of a clerk, rough like a dockman, stained with ink? Bird looked at his own hands as if recalling other lives they had performed. They were hands that had seen ink, he said at last. The knuckles were thin. He scrubbed them as if he had to make sure no black stuck to his skin. He dropped something, a thin strip of paper, while he was counting the coins, and the fish boy picked it up. The strip had numbers and a date, and a single name. Matthias felt a cold place in his stomach uncoil into something like the beginning of motion, a strip of paper. A dropped tail of the ledger. He had not expected any of it to be so ordinary, a dropped scrap, a fish boy's bored curiosity, a watchman's grumble. History, he thought, was made of inelegant acts dropped into gutters. What name? He asked, careful, trying to keep his voice level. His head filled with ledger pages, their ruled columns and neat numerals. The possibility that a single name might be enough to make the ledger live again sat in him like a small animal. Bird's lips pressed together. The fish boy showed me. He didn't think. He read it for the rhyme, it said Alden Corvin. The sound of his own family name corroded, ordinary lodged in Matthias' throat like a stone. It was as if some quiet current had lifted him and exposed an undershore he had never seen. Alden. The name belonged to those who had survived the war, to pewter spoons and permission and the quiet tasks of keeping records. He had not imagined his forebears' names would be written in a ledger of payment for betrayal. He had feared names like that might exist, but the fear once named became a different thing from the dull H had carried until then. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Do you mean Corvin?" "I'm sure of letters the way I am sure of steps in a parade," Bird said. I watched the fish boy read it. He spat at the thought and gave the strip back to the dockman. The dockman burned the paper in the brazier and swore. I was there. Matthias felt as if a hand had closed over his chest. It was not a revelation that declared whole truths, but one that opened a thin slit of possibility, his family name, appearing on a ledger of payments the night that the revolt fell. He sat down heavily on the bench, the pigeons rocking at his feet. Somewhere the city made the sound of ropes and a bell and a cart, and the world seemed for a moment to compress into the small geometry of a coin and an oilcloth. "Why tell me this?" he asked Bird, the words blunt as a file. "Why tell a scribe who erases?" Bird's eyes turned away to the river, where the water carried the city downstream like a rumor. "Because I know what you are," he said simply. "You look at papers like men look at maps. You think you can put right what was put wrong. If any man could, Matthias did not let him finish. He had no illusions. He had thought of himself as a clerk who moved within ordered rows. He was not a man of action. The ledger in his custody misfiled, smelling of smoke had been a private misfortune until now. The market had made it public in the one-way memory will, by planting fragments in other people's mouths. He left the bench with a strip of cloth around a scrap of oilcloth stuffed into his satchel, and with a slow, animal sense that a net had been thrown. The city seemed to watch him with a polite indifference. Children darted between legs, a bell pealed for the morning cannon, and a woman began to sweep the steps of a grocer with a broom that sounded like a tiny procession. Rumors moved faster than any courier. By midday a whisper brushed his shoulders in the scriptorium, a rumor of new seals for censures, a whisper of an edict that had passed quietly between the chancellor and certain magistrates. Thomas had spoken of more watchfulness along the river. Mira had mentioned the fish boy's brazier. Each thread did not yet have a knot, but Matthias could feel the possibility of tangles. At his desk in the pale light of the scriptorium, he unwrapped the scrap. The oilcloth smelled faintly of brine and coal. Within it lay a narrow strip of paper, edges burned where someone had tried to destroy proof without finishing the job. The writing was cramped and legal, a line of numerals, a date, and a name, Alden Corvin. Underneath, in a different hand, a notation, payment for delivery, for silence. The ink had faded, but the intent did not. Matthias sat there and read it 3 times, as if by sheer repetition he might deflect the ledger's consequences. The scriptorium hummed around him, the slow scratch of other pens, the soft breath of paper turned, and yet in his head a separate, keening chorus found room. A ledger, he thought, was like a bell. Once struck, it set its tone across the city. He could have taken it to Galen, the scriptorium master, and asked for counsel in the ways men in his position are told to ask, carefully, with deference. And with the institutional backing of the archive, he thought of Galen as a man who could, with a few calm sentences, put a cloth over this and fold it back into the fabric that kept the new order from unraveling. But the market had taught him that the cloth only hid the shape. Money reappeared, and so did names. He was not ready to trust the man who symbolized the scriptorium's ethics. Galen had his own reasons for discretion. Instead, he did a smaller thing. He copied the line into his private notebook with a hand that trembled but was determined. He drew the date and the name and the marginal note, and then, below it, he wrote the thin observation that had been Bird's, hands of clerk. Smudged seal, crescent. He wrapped the strip in fresh oilcloth and tucked it back into the satchel. Then he did something else he had not allowed himself to do before. He walked the route Tumas had described to the quay. The quay was not the quay of triumphant merchants any longer, but a place of work and shreds. The blue banner had indeed been torn. A slat of wood with its pale dye lay sodden against a post. The lamps flickered, and the men who worked the boats had the wary calculation of those whose lives were run by tides. No one stopped him. No one smiled in a way that invited confidence. He walked the moon berth along the line where the lamps smelled of fish and fat, and saw the patch of stone where a brazier had burned. Someone had swept the cinders into a neat heap, as if neatness might be a form of erasure. On his return, the scriptorium seemed to have been painted by a slightly colder hand. A notice posted on the wooden door proclaimed, in small legal type, a new regulation about seal usage and an exhortation about preservation of order. It began by direction of the Chancellor, and the words made his stomach close. He stood there reading it like a man might read the price of bread in a market, as if the thing that named possibility also defined how one must move. He could feel the city tightening. A ledger that linked his name to that night in the docks would not merely be a document to be catalogued. It would become an instrument against him and his family, or an instrument of justice. Either way, it would change the terrain under his feet. At his desk, he placed the copy of the strip into the drawer he used for private notes. He closed the drawer and rested his palms on the wood as if to seal the room in absence of certainty. Outside the windows, the market's distance became a murmur, questions traded like fish, the possibility that a name might be bought or sold like any other commodity. He had followed the breadcrumbs to a place where the trail was not yet a highway, but it was also no longer hidden. The ledger, which had once been a quiet, misfiled volume, had found a voice in the market's small economies. In the course of a day, anonymous hands had moved it. A dockman had burned a scrap, a fish boy had read a name and been offended, and a watchman had kept the memory like a flint in his breast. That pattern told Matthias a thing he had always suspected, but had not wanted in his bones. History was not only made in councils and courts. It was made in the slack of a rope, in the clink of a coin, in the private decisions of men who counted survival before virtue. He returned to his place as if he had completed a task, though he had not. The ledger's path had been extended by the market's testimony, but it had also drawn attention. The paper he now carried would not prove a standard of truth in any court that counted on the Chancellor's favor. It would, however, be a beginning. He would need more testimony, more corroboration, and it would require him to move beyond the market's salt and into the institutional corridors that smelled, somehow, of colder things, robes and wax and the light of the palace. When he left the scriptorium at dusk, The lamps along the avenue were being lit with the sort of ritual precision that made theatre work of governance. A proclamation boy ran by, the parchment in his hand a thin promise.